It must have been some imp of the perverse or some sardonic pull from dark, hidden sources which made me change my plans as I did. I had long before resolved to limit my observations to architecture alone, and I was even then hurrying toward the square in an effort to get quick transportation out of this festering city of death and decay. But the sight of old Zadok Allen set up new currents in my mind and made me slacken my pace uncertainly. I had been assured that the old man could do nothing but hint at wild, disjointed, and incredible legends, and I had been warned that the natives made it unsafe to be seen talking to him. Yet the thought of this aged witness to the town's decay, with memories going back to the early days of ships and factories, was a lure that no amount of reason could make me resist. After all, the strangest and maddest of myths are often merely symbols or allegories based upon truth, and old Zadok must have seen everything which went on in and around Innsmouth for the last 90 years. Curiosity flared up beyond sense and precaution, and in my youthful egotism I fancied I might be able to sift a nucleus of real history from the confused, extravagant outpouring I would probably extract with the aid of raw whiskey. I knew that I could not accost him then and there, for the firemen would surely notice and object. Instead, I reflected, I would prepare by getting some bootleg liquor at a place where the grocery boy had told me it was plentiful. Then I would loaf near the fire station in apparent casualness, and fall in with old Zadok after he had started on one of his frequent rambles. The youth said that he was very restless, seldom sitting around the station for more than an hour or two at a time. A quart bottle of whiskey was easily, though not cheaply, obtained in the rear of a dingy variety store just off the square in Elliott Street. The dirty-looking fellow who waited on me had a touch of the staring Innsmouth look, but was quite civil in his way, being perhaps used to the custom of such convivial strangers, truckmen, gold buyers, and the like, as were occasionally in town. Re-entering the square, I saw that luck was with me, for shuffling out of Payne Street around the corner of Gilman House, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of old Zadok Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle, and soon realized that he had begun to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Waite Street on my own to the most deserted region I could think of. I was steering my course by the map the grocery boy had prepared, and was aiming for the wholly abandoned stretch of southern waterfront which I had previously visited. The only people in sight there had been the fishermen on the distant breakwater, and by going a few squares south I could get beyond the range of these, finding a pair of seats on some abandoned wharf, and being free to question old Zadok unobserved for an indefinite time. Before I reached Main Street, I could hear a faint and wheezy, "Hey, mister!" behind me, and I presently allowed the old man to catch up and take copious pulls from the quart bottle. I began putting out feelers as we walked along to Water Street, and turned southward amidst the omnipresent desolation and crazy tilted ruins, but found that the aged tongue did not loosen as quickly as I had expected. At length I saw a grass-grown opening toward the sea between crumbling brick walls, with the weedy length of an earth and masonry wharf projecting beyond. Piles of moss-covered stones near the water promised tolerable seats, and the scene was sheltered from all possible view by a ruined warehouse on the north. Here, I thought, was the ideal place for a long, secret colloquy, so I guided my companion down the lane and picked out spots to sit in among the mossy stones. The air of death and desertion was ghoulish, and the smell of fish almost insufferable, but I was resolved to let nothing deter me. About 4 hours remained for conversation if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham, and I began to dole out more liquor to the ancient tippler, meanwhile eating my own frugal lunch. In my donations I was careful not to overshoot the mark, for I did not wish Zadok's vinous garrulousness to pass into a stupor. After an hour, his furtive taciturnity showed signs of disappearing, but much to my disappointment, he still sidetracked my questions about Innsmouth and its shadow-haunted past. He would babble of current topics, revealing a wide acquaintance with newspapers and a great tendency to philosophize in a sensuous village fashion. Toward the end of the second hour, I feared my quart of whiskey would not be enough to produce results, and was wondering whether I had better leave old Zadok and go back for more. Just then, however, chance made the opening which my questions had been unable to make, and the wheezing ancient's rambling took a turn that caused me to lean forward and listen alertly. My back was toward the fishy-smelling sea, but he was facing it, and something or other had caused his wandering gaze to light on the low, distant line of Devil Reef, then showing plainly and almost fascinatingly above the water. The sight seemed to displease him, for he began a series of weak curses, which ended in a confidential whisper and a knowing leer. He bent toward me, took hold of my coat lapel, and hissed out some hints that could not be mistaken. "There's where it all began, that cursed place of all wickedness, where the deep water starts. Gate of hell, sheer drop down to the bottom, no soundin', line can touch. Old Captain Obed's done it. Him that found out more'n was good for him in their Southern Sea Islands. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade falling off, mills losing business, even the new ones. And the best of our menfolks kilt a privateerin' in the War of 1812 or lost with the Elysee brig and the Ranger Snow. Both of 'em Gilman ventures. Obed Marsh, he had 3 ships afloat, Brigantine Columbia, Brig Hetty, and bark Sumatry Queen. He was the only one as kep on with the East Indian Pacific trade, though Edstras Martin's barkentine Malay Pride made a venture as late as 28. Never was nobody like Captain Obed, old limb o' Satan. I could mind him tellin' about furrin parts, and callin' all the folks stupid for goin' to Christian meetin' and bearin' their burdens meek and lowly. Says they'd orter get better gods like some of the folks in the Injies. Gods as 'ud bring 'em good fishin' in return for their sacrifices, and 'ud really answer folks' prayers. Matt Elliott, his first mate, talked a lot too, only he was agin' folks doing any heathen things. He was against folks doing any heathen things. Told 'em about an island east of Otaheite, where they was a lot of stone ruins older than anybody knew anything about, kind of like them on Panape in the Carolines, but with carvings of faces that looked like the big statues on Easter Island. They was a little volcanic island near that too, where they was other ruins with different carvings, ruins all wore away like they'd been under the sea once, and with pictures of awful monsters all over 'em. Well, sir, Matt, he says the natives around there had all the fish they could catch, and sported bracelets and armlets and head rings made out of queer kind of gold and covered with pictures of monsters just like the ones carved over the ruins on the little island. Sort of fish-like frogs or frog-like fishes that was drawed in all kinds of positions like they was human beings. Nobody could get out of them where they got all this stuff, and all the other natives wondered how they managed to find fish in plenty even when the very next islands had lean pickings. Matt, he got to wondering too, and so did Captain Obed. Obed, he notices, besides, that lots of the handsome young folks drop out of sight for good from year to year, and that they want too many of folks around. He even thinks some of the folks looks darned queer, even for Kanakies. It took Obed to get the truth out of them heathen. I don't know how he done it, but he begun by trading for the gold things they wore. Asked them where they come from and if they could get more, and finally wormed the story out of the old chief, Wallachia they called him. Nobody but Obed had ever believed the old yeller devil, but the captain could read folks like they were books. Nobody ever believes me now when I tell 'em, and I don't suppose you will, young feller, though come to look at you kind of have got them sharp reading eyes like Obed had. The old man's whisper grew fainter, and I found myself shuddering at the terrible and sincere portentousness of his intonation, even though I knew his tale could be nothing but drunken fantasy. Well, sir, Obed, he learnt that they's things on this earth as most folks never heard about and wouldn't believe him even if they did hear. It seems these Kanakys was sacrificing heaps of their young men and maidens to some kind of god things that lived under the sea and grittin' all kinds of favor in return. They met the things on this little islet with the queer ruins, and it seemed them awful pictures of frogfish monsters was supposed to be pictures of these things. Maybe they was the kind of critters as got all the mermaid stories and such started. They had all kinds of cities on the sea bottom, and this island was heaved up from there. Seems there was some of the things alive in the stone buildings when the island came up sudden to the surface. That's how the Kanakys got wind they was all down there. Made sign talk as soon as they got over being scared, and pieced up a bargain afore long. Them things liked human sacrifices. Had 'em ages before, but lost track of the upper world after a time. What they done to the victims, it ain't for me to say, and I guess Obed wasn't none too sharp about asking. But it was all right with the heathens, because they'd been having a hard time and was desperate about everything. They gave a certain number of young folks to the sea things twice every year, May Eve and Halloween, regular as could be. Also, give some of the carved knickknacks they made. What the things agreed to give in return was plenty of fish. They druv 'em in from all over the sea, and a few gold-like things now and then. Well, as I says, the natives met the things on this little volcanic islet, going thar in canoes with the sacrifices, etc., and bringing back any of the gold-like jewels as was coming to 'em. At first, the things didn't never go on to the main island, but after a time they come to want to. Seems they hankered after mixing with the folks and having joint ceremonies on the big days, May Eve and Halloween. You see, they was able to live both in and out of the water, what they call amphibians, I guess. The Kanakys told him as how folks from the other island might want to wipe 'em out if they got wind of their being there, but they says they don't care much because they could wipe out the whole brood of humans if they was willing to bother. That is, any as didn't have certain signs such as was used once by the lost old ones, whoever they was. But not wanting to bother, they'd lay low when anybody visited the island. When it came to mating with them toad-looking fishes, the Kanakys kind of balked, but finally they learnt something as put a new face on the matter. Seems that human folks has got a kind of relation to such water beasts, that everything alive come out of the water once and only needs a little change to go back again. Them things told the Kanakys that if they mixed bloods, there'd be children as'd look human at first, but later turn more and more like the things, till finally they'd take to the water and join the main lot of things down there. And this is the important part, young feller. Them as turned into fish things and went into the water wouldn't never die. Them things never died, except they was killed violent. Well, sir, it seemed by the time Obed knowed them islanders, they was all full of fish blood from them deep water things. When they get old and began to show it, they was kept hid until they felt like taking to the water and quitting the place. Some was more touched than others, and some never did change quite enough to take to the water. But mostly they turned out just fine, just the way them things said. Them as was born more like the things changed early, but them as was nearly human sometimes stayed on the island till they was just past 70, though they'd usually go down under for trips before that. Folks as had took down to the water generally came back a good deal to visit, so's a man would often be a-talking to his own 5 times great-grandfather who'd left the dry land a couple 100 years or so afore. Everybody got out of the idea of dying except in canoe wars with the other islanders, or as sacrifices to the sea gods down below, or from snakebite or plague or sharp galloping ailments or something afore they could take to the water, but simply look forward to a kind of change that Wasn't a bit horrible after a while. They thought what they'd got was well worth all they'd had to give up, and I guess Obed had come to think the same himself when he chewed over old Wallacheia's story a bit. Wallachia, though, was one of the few as hadn't got none of the fish blood, being of a royal line that intermarried with royal lines on other islands. Wallachia, he showed Obed a lot of rites and incantations as had to do with the sea things, and let him see some of the folks in the villages had changed a lot from human shape. Somehow or other, though, he never would let him see one of the regular things from right out of the water. In the end, he gave him a funny kind of thingamajig made out of lead or something, that he said would bring up the fish things from any place in the water where they might be a nest of them. The idea was to drop it down with the right kind of prayers and such. Wallachia allowed as the things was scattered all over the world, so as anybody that looked about could find a nest and bring 'em up if they was wanted. Matt, he didn't like this business at all, and wanted Obed keep away from the island. But the captain was sharp for gain, and found he could get 'em gold-like things so cheap it'd pay him to make a specialty of 'em. Things went on that way for years, and Obed got enough of that gold-like stuff to make him start the refinery in Waite's old run-down fulling mill. He didn't dast sell the pieces like they was, for folks would be all the time asking questions. All the same, his crews would get a piece and dispose of it now and then, even though they swore to keep quiet, and he let his women folks wear some of the pieces as was more human-like than most. Well, come about 38, when I was about 7 years old, Obed, he found the island people all wiped out between voyages. Seems the other islanders had got wind of what was going on and had took matters into their own hands. Suppose they must have had, after all, them old magic signs as the sea thing says was the only things they were afeard of. No tellin' what any of them Kanakis will chance to get a holt of when the sea bottom throws up some islands with ruins older than the deluge. Pious cusses, these was. They didn't leave nothin' standin' on either the main island or the little volcanic islet except what parts of the ruins was too big to knock down. In some places, they was little stones strewed about, like charms, with something on 'em like what you call a swastika nowadays. Probably them was the old ones' signs. Folks all wiped out, no trace of no gold-like things, and none of the nearby Kanakis would breathe a word about the matter. Wouldn't even admit they'd ever been any people on that island. That naturally hit Obed pretty hard, seeing as his normal trade was doing very poor. It hit the whole of Innsmouth, too, because in seafaring days what profited the master of a ship generally profited the crew proportionate. Most of the folks around the town took the hard times kind of sheep-like and resigned. They was in bad shape because the fishin' was petering out and the mills wasn't doing none too well. Then's the time Obed he began a cursin' at the folks for being dull sheep and praying to a Christian heaven as didn't help him none. He told him he'd know to folks as prayed to gods and give something you really need, and says if a good bunch of men would stand by him, he could maybe get a hold of certain powers as'd bring the plenty fish and quite a bit of gold. Of course, them as saved on the Sumatry Queen and seed the island knowed what he meant, and wa'n't none too anxious to get close to see things like they'd heard tell on. But them as didn't know what 'twas all about got kind of swayed by what Obed had to say, and begun to ask him what he could do to set him on the way to the faith as'd bring him results. Here the old man faltered, mumbled, and lapsed into a moody and apprehensive silence, glancing nervously over his shoulder, and then turning back to stare fascinatedly at the distant black reef. When I spoke to him, he did not answer, so I knew I would have to let him finish the bottle. The insane yarn I was hearing interested me profoundly, for I fancied there was contained within it a sort of crude allegory based upon the strangeness of Innsmouth, and elaborated by an imagination at once creative and full of scraps of exotic legend. Not for a moment did I believe that the tale had any really substantial foundation, but nonetheless the account held a hint of genuine terror, if only because it brought in reference to strange jewels clearly akin to the malign tiara I had seen at Newburyport. Perhaps the ornaments had, after all, come from some strange island, and possibly the wild stories were lies of the bygone Obed himself rather than of this antique toper. I handed Zadok the bottle, and he drained it to the last drop. It was curious how he could stand so much whiskey, for not even a trace of thickness had come into his high, wheezy voice. He licked the nose of the bottle and slipped it into his pocket. Then, beginning to nod and whisper softly to himself, I bent close to catch any articulate words he might utter, and thought I saw a sardonic smile behind the stained, bushy whiskers. Yes, he was really forming words, and I could grasp a fair proportion of them. Poor Matt. Matt, he always was against it. Tried to line up the folks on his side and had long talks with the preachers. No use. They run the congressional parson out of town, and the Methodist feller quit and never did see Resolve Babcock, the Baptist parson, again. Wrath of Jehovah. I was a mighty little critter, but I heard what I heard and seen what I seen. Dagon and Ashtoreth, Belial and Beelzebub, golden calf and the idols of Canaan, and the Philistines, Babylonish abominations. Mene tekel a parson. He stopped again, and from the look in his watery blue eyes I feared he was close to a stupor after all. But when I gently shook his shoulder, he turned on me with astonishing alertness and snapped out some more obscure phrases. Don't believe me, eh? And just tell me, young feller, why Captain Obed and 20-odd other folks used to row out to Devil's Reef in dead of night and chant things so loud you could hear 'em all over town when the wind was right. Tell me that, eh? And tell me why Obed was always dropping heavy things down into the deep water the other side of the reef, where the bottom shoots down like a cliff, lower'n you can sound? And tell me what he'd done with that funny-shaped lead thingamajig as Wallachia gave him? Hey, boy. And what did they all howl on May Eve and again the next Halloween? And why'd the new church parsons, fellers as used to be sailors, wear them queer robes and cover themselves with them gold-like things Obed brung, hey? The watery blue eyes were almost savage and maniacal now, and the dirty white beard bristled electrically. Old Zadok probably saw me shrink back, for he had begun to cackle evilly. Beginning to see, eh? Maybe you'd like to been me in them days when I seed things at night out to sea from the cupola top of my house. Oh, I can tell you, little pitchers have big ears, and I wasn't missing nothing of what was gossiped about Captain Obed and the folks out to the reef. How about the night I took my pa's ship's glass up to the cupola and seed the reef a bristling thick with shapes that drove off quick soon as the moon riz? Obed and the folks was in a dory, but them shapes dove off the far side into the deep water and never come up. How'd you like to be a little shaver alone up in a cupola a-watching shapes as wasn't human shapes? Hey? The old man was getting hysterical, and I began to shiver with a nameless alarm. He laid a gnarled claw on my shoulder, and it seemed to me that its shaking was not altogether that of mirth. Suppose one night you seed something heavy heaved off'n Obed's dory beyond the reef, and them learned next day a young feller was missing from home, hey? Did anybody ever see hide or hair of Hiram Gilman again, did they? And Nick Pierce, and Llewellyn Waite, and Adoniram Southwick, and Henry Garrison, hey? Shapes talking sign language with their hands, them as had real hands. Well, sir, that was the time Obed began to get on his feet again. Folks see his 3 darters a-wearing gold-like things as nobody ever see on him before, and smoke started coming out of the refinery chimney. Other folks were prospering too. Fish began to swarm into the harbor fit to kill, and heaven knows what sized cargoes we began to ship out to Newburyport, Arkham, and Boston. 'Twas then Obed got the Old Branch Railroad put through. Some Kingsport fishermen heard about the catch and come up in sloops, but they was all lost. Nobody ever seen 'em again. and just then our folks organized the Esoteric Order of Dagon and bought Masonic Hall off an cavalry commandery for it. Matt Elliott was a Mason and again the Selin, but he dropped out of sight just then. Remember, I ain't saying Obed was set on having things just like they was on that Kanaki Isle. I don't think he aimed at first to do no mixin' nor raise no young'uns to take to the water and turn into fishes with eternal life. He wanted them gold things and was willing to pay heavy, and I guess others was satisfied for a while. Come in 46, the town done some lookin' and thinkin' for itself. Too many folks missin'. Too much wild preachin' at meetin' of a Sunday. Too much talk about that reef. I guess done a bit by tellin' Selectman Mowry what I seen from the cupola. They was a party one night as followed Obed's crowd out to the reef, and I heard shots betwixt the dories. Next day Obed and 32 others was in a jail, with everybody a-wonderin' just was afoot and just what charge against him could be got to hold. God, if anybody had looked ahead a couple weeks later than when nothings had been throwed into the sea for that long. Zadok was showing signs of fright and exhaustion, and I let him keep silence for a while, though glancing apprehensively at my watch. The tide had turned, it was coming in now, and the sound of the waves seemed to arouse him. I was glad of that tide, for at high water the fishy smell might not be so bad. Again I strained to catch his whispers. That awful night I seed 'em. I was up in the cupola, hordes of 'em, swarms of 'em, all over the reef and swimming up the harbor into the Manizette. God, what happened in the streets of Innsmouth that night? They rattled our door, but Pa wouldn't open. Then he clumb out to the kitchen window with his musket to find Selectman Mowry and see what he could do. Mounds of the dead and the dying, shots and screams, shouting in Old Square and Town Square and New Church Green, jail throwed open. Proclamation, treason, called it the plague when folks come in and found half our people missing. Nobody left but them as a join with the Obed and them things, or else kept quiet. Never heard of my pa no more. The old man was panting and perspiring profusely. His grip on my shoulder tightened. Everything cleaned up in the morning, but there were traces. Obed, he kinder takes charge and says things is going to be changed. Others'll worship with us in meeting time, and certain houses has got to entertain guests. They wanted to mix like they had done with the Kanakis, and he, for one, didn't feel bound to stop 'em. Far gone was Obed, just like a crazy man on the subject. He says they bring us fish and treasure and should have what they hankered after. Nothing was to be different on the outside, only we was to keep shy of strangers if we knowed what was good for us. We all had to take the oath of Dagon, and later on they was second and third oaths that some of us took. Them as I'd help special. It'd get special rewards, gold and such. No use balkin', for they was millions of 'em down there. They'd rather not start rising and wiping out humankind, but if they was gave away and forced to, they could do a lot just like that. We didn't have them old charms to keep 'em off like folks in the Southern Sea did, and them Kanakis wouldn't have never given away their secrets. Yield up enough sacrifices and savage knickknacks and arborage in the town when they wanted it, and they'd let well enough alone. Wouldn't bother no strangers, might bear tales outside, that is, without they got pryin'. All in the band of the faithful, Order of Dagon. And the children should never die, but go back to the Mother Hydra and Father Dagon, what we all come from once. Ya, Cthulhu, Pythagon, Penugli, Maligwanaf, Cthulhu, Relie, Wog, Nuggle, Pythagon. Old Zadok was fast lapsing into stark raving, and I held my breath. Poor old soul, to what pitiful depths of hallucination had his liquor, plus his hatred of the decay, alienage, and disease around him, brought that fertile imaginative brain. He began to moan now, and tears were coursing down his channeled cheeks into the depths of his beard. God, what I seen since I was 15 years old! Mene, Tekel, a parson. The folks as was missing and them as kilt theirselves, them as told things in Arkham or Ipswich or such places was all called crazy like you're a-calling me right now. But God, what had I seen? They'd a killed me long ago for what I know, only I'd took the first and second oaths of Dagon off an Obed, so was protected unless in a jury of 'em proved I told things, knowin' and deliberate. But I wouldn't take that third oath. I'd have died rather than take that. It got was around Civil War time when children born since 46 began to grow up. Some of 'em, that is. I was afeard. Never did no pryin' after that awful night, and never seen one of them close to in all my life. That is, never no full-blooded one. I went to the war, and if I'd had any guts or sense, I'd have never come back, but settled away from here. But folks wrote me things. Wasn't so bad. That, I suppose, was because government draft men was in town after 63. After the war, it was just as bad again. People began to fall off, mills and shops shut down, shipping stopped and the harbor choked up. Railroad give up, but they never stopped swimming in and out of the river from that cursed reef of Satan. And more attic winders got boarded up, and more noises was heard in houses as wasn't supposed to have nobody in 'em. Folks outside have their stories about us. Suppose you've heard a plenty on 'em. Seeing what questions ye asked, and stories about things they've seen now and then, and about that queer jewelry as still comes in from somewheres ain't quite all melted up. But nothing never gets definite. Nobody'll believe nothing. They call 'em gold light things pirate loot, and allow the Innsmouth folks has foreign blood or is distempered or something. Besides, them that lives here shoo off as many strangers as they can and encourage the rest not to get very curious, specially round night time. Beasts balk at the critters, houses wussin' mules, and when they got autos, that was all right. In 46, Captain Obed took a second wife that nobody in the town never see. Some says he didn't want to, but was made to by them as he called in. Had 3 children by her, 2 has disappeared young, but one gal has looked like nobody else and was educated in Europe. Obed finally got her married off by a trick to an Arkham feller, as didn't suspect nothing. But nobody outside have nothing to do with Innsmouth folks now. Barnabas Marsh, that runs the refinery now, is Obed's grandson by his first wife, son of Onesiphorus, his oldest son. But his mother was another of them as wasn't never seen side outdoors. Right now, Barnabas is about changed. Can't shut his eyes no more, and is all out of shape. They say he still wears clothes, but he'll take to the water soon. Maybe he's tried it already. They do sometimes go down for little spells afore they go for good. Ain't been seed about in public for nigh on 10 year. Don't know how his poor wife can feel. She come from Ipswich, and they nigh lynched Barnabas when he courted her 50-odd years ago. Obed, he died in 78, and all the next generation is gone now. The first wife's children's dead, and the rest, God knows. The sound of the incoming tide was now very insistent, and little by little it seemed to change the old man's mood from maudlin tearfulness to watchful fear. He would pause now and then to renew those nervous glances over his shoulder or out toward the reef, and despite the wild absurdity of his tale, I could not help beginning to share his vague apprehensiveness. Zadok now grew shriller, and seemed to be trying to whip up his courage with louder speech. "Hey, you! Why don't you say something? How'd you like to be living in a town like this with everything a-rottin' and a-dyin' and boarded up, monsters crawling and bleatin' and barking and hopping around black cellars and attics every way you turn? Hey, how'd you like to hear the howlin' night after night from the churches and order of Dagon? Hal, and know what's doing part of the howlin'? How'd you like to hear what comes from that awful reef every May Eve and Hallowmass? Hey, think the old man's crazy, eh? Well, sir, let me tell, that ain't the worst." Zadok was really screaming now, and the mad frenzy of his voice disturbed me more than I care to own. Curse ye! Don't set there a-staring at me with them eyes. I tell Obed Marsh he's in hell, and he's got to stay there. In hell, I says. Can't get me. I ain't done nothing nor told nobody nothing. Oh, you young feller? Well, even if I hain't told you nobody nothing yet, I'm a-going to now. You just set still and listen to me, boy. This is what I ain't never told nobody. I says I didn't do no pryin' after that night, but I found things out just the same. You want to know what the real horror is, hey? Well, it's this. It ain't what them fish devils has done, but what they're a-gonna do. They're a-bringin' things up out of where they come from into the town. Been doing it for years, and slacking it up lately. Them houses north of the river betwixt Water and Main Streets is full of 'em. Them devils and what they brung, and what they get ready. I say, when they get ready. Ever hear tell of a Shoggoth? Hey, did you hear me? I tell you, I know what them things be. I seen 'em one night when... Ah! The hideous suddenness and inhuman frightfulness of the old man's shriek almost made me faint. His eyes, looking past me toward the malodorous sea, were positively starting from his head, while his face was a mask of fear worthy of a Greek tragedy. His bony claw dug monstrously into my shoulder, and he made no motion as I turned my head to look at whatever he had glimpsed. There was nothing that I could see, only the incoming tide with perhaps one set of ripples more local than the long-flung line of breakers. But now Zadok was shaking me, and I turned back to watch the melting of that fear-frozen face into a chaos of twitching eyelids and mumbling gums. Presently his voice came back, albeit as a trembling whisper. "Get out of here! Get out of here! They seen us! Get out for your life! Don't wait for nothing! They know now! Run for it! Quick! Out of this town!" Another heavy wave dashed against the loosening masonry of the bygone wharf, and changed the mad ancient's whisper to another inhuman blood-curdling scream. Before I could recover my scattered wits, he had relaxed his clutch on my shoulder and dashed wildly inland toward the street, reeling northward around the ruined warehouse wall. I glanced back at the sea, but there was nothing there, and when I reached Water Street and looked along it toward the north, there was no remaining trace of Zadok Allen.